Story number 1.
The night was unusually quiet when Jeremy started his shift at the small-town convenience store, a place he'd worked part-time for the past year. The store was tucked away at the edge of town, right where the streetlights faded into thick patches of trees that stretched out for miles. It was the kind of place most people avoided after dark. Jeremy didn't mind. The night shift meant fewer customers and a chance to catch up on his music or just zone out behind the counter. Around midnight, Jeremy's phone buzzed, a text from his girlfriend, Emma. They had plans for the weekend, and she was just reminding him to pick her up early. He smiled, typing back a quick reply. The store was otherwise empty, the soft hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound. At about 1:15 a.m., he heard the door chime. He looked up, expecting the usual late-night wanderer or a trucker grabbing coffee, but no one was there. The automatic door had been activated, but the parking lot was empty, shadowed by the looming trees. Jeremy frowned. Must have been the wind, he muttered. He checked the security cameras. The feed showed the front entrance. No sign of anyone. Nothing on the parking lot or the sidewalk either, just empty space. Shrugging it off, Jeremy went back to restocking shelves near the back. That's when he noticed the freezer door slightly ajar. He was sure he'd closed it earlier. He shut it firmly and turned back. The store's radio crackled, the usual late-night talk show interrupted by static and faint whispering voices. Jeremy lowered the volume, unsettled by the strange noise. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered. One went out entirely, plunging the aisle into darkness. Jeremy fumbled for his phone's flashlight and shone it toward the ceiling panel where the bulb had blown. While fixing the light, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. From the corner of his eye, movement. A shadow slipped past the glass door of the cooler. He called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. He grabbed the store's phone to call his manager, but the line was dead. He checked the other phones. All dead. Jeremy's unease grew. He grabbed the store keys, intending to lock the doors and call it a night, but the doors wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, heart racing. The door handle rattled violently from the other side. He froze. "Who's there?" he shouted. Silence, except for the rattling. Jeremy scanned the parking lot through the glass but saw nothing. Then a soft tapping began on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. It was slow, deliberate. Jeremy stumbled back. He remembered an old exit door at the back of the store leading to the alley. He ran to it, unlocked it, and stepped outside. The cold night air hit him hard. He looked around the alley. It was empty, but at the end near the dumpsters he saw a figure. A woman in a long, tattered dress, hair tangled and wet, standing motionless in the shadows. Her eyes glowed faintly. Jeremy's blood ran cold. He stepped back inside and locked the door. The tapping stopped. The lights flickered back on. He tried the front door again. Still locked. His phone buzzed. An unknown number texted him, "Don't leave." Panic rising, Jeremy backed away from the door. Then the radio turned back on, louder this time. The whispers formed words. "Don't leave." Jeremy's breath caught. He ran to the counter and grabbed the fire extinguisher. He wasn't sure what he'd do if the woman inside the store appeared, but he knew he wasn't going down without a fight. Minutes passed. The radio went silent. The door unlocked with a soft click. Jeremy didn't hesitate. He bolted outside, sprinting to his car. He didn't look back until he was safely home. But that night, the whispers returned, and the tapping never stopped. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The clock on the wall struck midnight, just as Emma pulled into the empty parking lot of the old gas station. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still thick with clouds, swallowing whatever moonlight might have peeked through. She rubbed her tired eyes, feeling the weight of the day press down on her shoulders. Driving back home after the late shift had been exhausting, but when her car sputtered and died halfway through the stretch of highway, she had no choice but to pull over. She stepped out into the cold night, the crunch of gravel beneath her boots loud in the stillness. The gas station was closed, dark and lifeless, except for a flickering neon sign above the door that hummed erratically. She pulled her jacket tighter around her, shivering in the damp air. The highway was deserted. No cars in sight, no sounds, but the distant rustle of trees swaying in the breeze. She took a deep breath and walked toward the station, hoping to find a phone to call for help. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of old cigarette smoke and something metallic she couldn't place. The shelves were dusty, stocked with remnants of days long gone, empty candy boxes, faded magazines, a few cans of soda that looked more like decorations than inventory. The lights flickered sporadically, casting long shadows that danced on the cracked linoleum floor. Emma reached the counter where the cash register sat silent, its drawers shut tight. There was no one around. She fumbled for her phone, but it was dead. No signal. A wave of anxiety washed over her. How long would it take for someone to pass by this desolate stretch? The realization that she was utterly alone hit hard. Suddenly, the door behind her creaked open. Emma spun around, heart pounding, but the street outside was empty. Only wet pavement glistened under the flickering neon. She turned back to the counter and noticed something odd. A faint outline of muddy footprints leading from the door to the back of the store. The prints were wet, fresh. Her skin prickled. She hadn't heard anyone come in, and the back door, usually locked, was slightly ajar. Curiosity tangled with fear as she moved toward the back. The hallway beyond was narrow and dim, lined with peeling paint and flickering bulbs that cast a sickly yellow glow. At the end was the storage room door, cracked open just a bit. Emma hesitated, then pushed it wide. Inside was darkness, thick and suffocating. She flicked on her phone's flashlight and scanned the room. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, long-forgotten tools and supplies strewn about. But there was something else, a movement in the corner. Just at the edge of the light, a figure, a man, crouched low, his clothes soaked and smeared with dirt and blood. His face was pale, gaunt, eyes wild with fear and desperation. He looked up at Emma, lips trembling. "Please, help me." Her breath caught. "What happened?" he whispered, voice hoarse. "They're out there, watching. I don't know how long I've been hiding." Emma glanced toward the back door, suddenly slammed shut by a gust of wind or maybe something else. The man stood shakily. "We have to get out, now," she nodded, heart hammering. Together, they hurried back to the front, but the store felt different now. Heavier, colder. The flickering neon sign buzzed erratically, casting erratic shadows that seemed to twist and writhe. As they reached the door, the man froze. "Listen," he said, voice barely a whisper. From outside came a faint scraping noise, like claws dragging along metal. Emma peered through the window. The parking lot was empty, but the shadows beneath the trees moved unnaturally. Something was out there. The man grabbed her arm, pulling her back inside. "They won't let us leave." Suddenly the lights went out, plunging them into total darkness. Emma's phone flickered once, then died. In the blackness, the scraping grew louder. "Closer," the man whispered. "Hide." They slipped into the narrow hallway again, hearts pounding in the silence. The door to the storage room shook violently, as if something was trying to break through. Emma pressed her back against the wall, trying to control her breathing. Then a low, guttural growl echoed from the other side. The door cracked open, and a pale hand, long and twisted, slipped inside. The man grabbed a rusty metal rod from the floor and swung it blindly. The thing recoiled, a terrible scream filling the air. Emma saw it then, a creature, gaunt and inhuman, with hollow eyes that burned with malevolence. It lunged at them, and the fight was chaos, metal clashing, desperate screams of the sickening sound of flesh tearing. When the first light of dawn finally crept through the grimy windows, Emma was alone. The creature was gone. The man lay motionless, face frozen in terror. The gas station was silent once more. Emma stumbled out into the pale morning, the nightmare seared into her mind. She never spoke of that night, but sometimes in the dead of night, when the wind howls just right, she can still hear the scraping, waiting in the shadows. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The night I started working at the old gas station on Route 17, I thought it was just another boring overnight job. I'd been in and out of odd jobs for a while, trying to keep the lights on and food on the table. This one paid better than most. Night shifts, low traffic, minimal supervision. The kind of job where you sit, count inventory, and maybe deal with a few truckers or late-night travelers. What could go wrong? The station was tucked into a curve on the highway, surrounded by thick woods on one side and a rundown diner on the other. The building itself was old, weathered signs, cracked concrete, and a small convenience store attached to the pumps. It was the kind of place that looked like it had been standing there since the 70s and probably would stand for decades more. My first few nights were quiet. The only sound, the hum of the overhead lights and the occasional rumble of a semi-truck pulling in for diesel. I got into a routine, checking the pump meters, wiping down the counters, and occasionally nodding to the security cameras on the monitor behind the register. On the third night, just after midnight, the quiet shattered. The front door chimed, and I looked up from the paperwork. A man stood just inside the doorway. He was wearing a dark hoodie, pulled up low over his head, shadowing his face. His jeans were soaked and water dripped from the cuffs, forming small puddles on the floor. "Hey," I said, trying to sound friendly. "Can I get you anything?" He didn't respond. He just stood there, staring past me toward the back of the store, where the restrooms were. His eyes, when I caught a glimpse, were glassy and empty, almost lifeless. I shrugged and went back to my work, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw him move slowly toward the back door, the one that led to the storage room and the restrooms. I walked after him, thinking maybe he needed directions or something. He stopped at the door and, without a word, pushed it open. A chill rolled out from the room. I stepped in after him, the smell of damp earth and decay hitting me instantly. The storage room was cluttered with old boxes and rusted shelves, but the back wall was different. The paint was peeling, revealing a dark stain that looked like water damage but had an unsettling, almost wet sheen to it. Suddenly, the man was gone. I spun around, but there was no sign of him. The door slammed shut behind me, and I was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my phone and flashlight. When I shone the light around, the stain on the wall seemed to pulse, as if alive, spreading slowly across the peeling paint like a tide. A cold breath brushed my neck. I turned, but no one was there. I scrambled to the door, pulling it open and rushing out. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The next day, I told my manager what happened, but he laughed it off, saying the old building was probably settling and the plumbing was known to leak. He said these kinds of things were common in old stations like this. But I knew better. That night, around 2 a.m., the power flickered and went out. The emergency lights buzzed weakly, casting an eerie red glow over everything. I was restocking the snack aisle when I heard water dripping, steady, slow, somewhere close by. I followed the sound to the restroom door. It was closed, but the dripping was louder now. I opened the door and stepped inside. The tiles were wet, and the floor had a thin layer of water pooling. I knelt to check the drain, but it was clogged with mud and debris. Suddenly, the water in the sink started to bubble, and a faint whispering rose from the drain. I stood up, heart pounding, and the lights flickered back on. The restroom was dry again, but on the mirror, someone had written, "Help me." I spun around, but I was alone. I left the station early that night. Over the next few days, I tried to ignore it, but strange things kept happening. Items moved on their own. The phone behind the counter would ring with no one on the other end, and sometimes, late at night, I'd see a shadow standing just outside the window, staring in. I asked around town about the station's history and learned it had been built over what used to be a marshland. Years ago, a young man had drowned nearby, his body never recovered. Locals whispered that his spirit lingered, unable to move on. On my last night there, I decided to stay late and face whatever was haunting the place. At 3 a.m., the lights went out again. I heard the dripping, the whispering. I grabbed a flashlight and headed to the storage room. The back wall was wet and pulsing. I heard a voice, soft and pleading, "Find me." I reached out to touch the wall. Suddenly, icy water surged through the floor, soaking my boots. The air grew thick and the temperature dropped sharply. I saw a figure, a young man, pale and translucent, trapped behind the wall, trying to reach out. I stumbled back, heart racing. The figure whispered, "Help me find peace." I didn't know how, but I promised. I left the station and never returned. Sometimes when I drive by that old gas station at night, I see a faint glow from the storage room window and hear the steady drip of water, and I wonder if he's still waiting. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The clock on the wall ticked past midnight as I sat alone in the dim living room of the small house I had just moved into. It was a rental, the kind of place people never stay in very long, wedged between two larger homes on a quiet suburban street. I had taken the job as a night security guard at a nearby warehouse, so I needed a place that was close but affordable. This house fit the bill, and the landlord promised it had no history of trouble. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural, never had. But what happened that night changed everything I thought I knew. I had just gotten home from my shift, exhausted but feeling a strange kind of peace settling over me. The neighborhood was silent except for the occasional bark of a distant dog and the soft rustling of leaves in the cool spring breeze. I was about to make a cup of coffee when the power flickered. The lights dimmed for a split second before coming back on. I paused, fingers resting on the kettle's handle. That flicker didn't sit right with me. Setting the kettle down, I moved toward the window to glance outside. The street was empty, the faint glow of streetlights cutting through the night. I noticed the shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual, bending oddly around the old oak tree at the end of the block. I shook my head, dismissing it as a trick of the light. Back in the kitchen, the kettle began to whistle. I poured the hot water into my mug and took a slow sip, the warmth settling in my chest. Then, just as I was about to turn on the television, the old rotary phone on the wall rang. I hadn't even noticed it since I moved in, the kind of phone no one really uses anymore. I glanced at it, my heart skipping. Who would be calling at this hour? I hesitated, but then picked up the receiver. "Hello," I said, voice cautious. Silence. No breathing, no background noise, just the faint static hiss you get from a disconnected line. I was about to hang up when a low whisper floated through the receiver, barely audible. "Help?" My blood ran cold. "Who is this?" I whispered. No response. I slammed the phone back onto the cradle, the click loud in the stillness. I tried to convince myself it was a prank call or some kind of interference. Maybe a leftover signal from the old line. The landlord had mentioned the phone wasn't connected to anything anymore. Still, the word help echoed in my mind. Later, as I got ready for bed, I noticed the hallway mirror. It was old, its surface mottled with age, and I thought I saw something reflected behind me, a flicker of movement. I spun around. Nothing. Just the dimly lit hallway stretching back toward my bedroom. I told myself it was my imagination. I'd had a long day, and I was tired. The house creaked and settled as old houses do. But then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, pacing back and forth down the hallway outside my bedroom door. I froze beneath the covers, heart hammering. The footsteps stopped, a heavy silence. Then a slow scratching noise like nails scraping wood just beyond the door. I whispered, "Who's there?" No answer. I reached for my phone. No signal. I thought about calling the landlord or the police, but was rooted in place by fear. Suddenly, the bedroom door creaked open. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway, motionless, its features obscured by darkness. I scrambled out of bed, grabbed a baseball bat I kept for protection, and lunged toward the figure. It vanished. Cold air brushed past me, carrying a faint scent of decay. I bolted out of the room, down the stairs, and out the front door. Outside, the night was unnaturally still. No cars, no neighbors, just an oppressive silence. I drove to the police station, out trembling, but when I told my story, the officer listened politely but was skeptical. "There's no sign of anyone at your house. No footprints. No forced entry." I returned home with a friend the next day. We searched every inch of the house. Nothing. No sign of disturbance. No explanation. Weeks later, I discovered something unsettling. In the town's old archives, I found a newspaper clipping about the house. A man named Robert Hendricks had lived there decades ago. He was a recluse who vanished one night without a trace. Locals whispered he had gone mad, tormented by voices and shadows. Some said his spirit never left. I moved out the next day, but sometimes late at night I still hear the faint whisper of help carried on the wind. And I know that some darkness never truly fades. Story. The end.
Story number 5.
The night had a weight to it, the kind you don't notice at first, just a subtle heaviness that settles deep into your bones. I was driving home from my shift at the hospital, the clock hovering just past 2 a.m. The roads were deserted, except for the occasional flicker of headlights in the distance. The rain was steady, a soft but relentless drizzle that blurred the edges of everything. I had taken this late shift because I needed the extra money, and besides, I liked the quiet. The hospital's emergency room was a different kind of chaos, but the drive home was supposed to be peaceful. I was on a stretch of highway that cut through miles of forest and farmland, the kind of place where cell phone service vanished and your only company was the hum of your engine and the sound of rain on the windshield. That's when I noticed the car in front of me, a battered old sedan, moving at an agonizingly slow pace, its brake lights flickering like a warning. I was about to pass it when the car suddenly slammed its brakes, coming to a dead stop in the middle of the road. I slammed on my brakes, the tires screeching on the wet pavement as I skidded to a stop just behind the car. I tapped the horn, but there was no response. The driver's side window was down and I could see a figure slumped over the steering wheel. A sinking feeling started to grow in my chest. I stepped out into the rain, pulling my jacket tighter against the cold. The air smelled damp and earthy, the kind of smell that makes you feel small and exposed. I approached the car cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the soaked ground. As I got closer, I noticed the driver's door was unlocked. I reached for the handle, heart pounding, and pulled it open. Inside, the driver was a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, her head lolled to the side, eyes closed, pale and still. My breath caught. I checked her pulse, weak but there. She was alive but unconscious. I fumbled for my phone, but as I feared, no signal. The rain was getting harder now, drumming on the roof of the car. I tried the door again to get her out, but it was stuck fast, like the frame had warped or been bent. I looked around for help, but the forest on either side of the highway was dense and dark, the trees towering like silent sentinels. There was no sign of other vehicles or houses. I took a deep breath and leaned in, trying to wake her. "Hey, can you hear me? Please, wake up." No response. Then I saw it, a scrap of paper wedged between her fingers, soaked through, but still legible. I pulled it gently free and read the hastily scrawled words, "Don't trust them. They're watching. Help me." A chill ran down my spine. I glanced up at the rearview mirror and caught movement in the woods, something just beyond the tree line, a shadow shifting. I blinked, and it was gone. I was alone, stuck in the middle of nowhere with a woman who needed help and no way to call for it. I knew I had to get her out of the car, but the door wouldn't budge. I looked around and spotted a large branch lying near the edge of the forest. I grabbed it and started hammering at the window. The glass cracked but didn't shatter. Panic gnawed at me. The driver was losing consciousness. Every second counted. Suddenly, the air went still. The rain seemed to stop. I froze, listening. From the trees came a faint whisper, almost carried by the wind, but it was more than that. It was words, broken, desperate. "Help us." I spun around, heart thudding in my chest. The shadows between the trees twisted and coalesced, and I felt eyes watching me. Hundreds of eyes. The whispers grew louder. "Please, don't let them take us again." The sky darkened further, even though it was already the dead of night. I stumbled back, dragging the branch. The woman's door suddenly creaked open on its own. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed her arm and pulled her out, her body limp in my grip. She gasped awake, eyes wild with fear. "They're coming," she whispered, voice trembling. I supported her as we ran toward my car. Behind us, the shadows seemed to pour out of the forest, merging into twisted forms, humanoid but wrong, faceless and distorted. I slammed the door shut and started the engine. As I drove away, the headlights cutting through the rain, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The shadows stayed at the edge of the forest, watching, waiting. The woman clutched my hand, eyes fixed on the window. "I don't know who they are," she said, voice cracking, "but they've been hunting me for days. They take people, and no one ever finds them again." She explained between shivering breaths that she had been driving away from an old cabin deep in the woods where something terrible had happened years ago. Locals told stories of disappearances, of people vanishing without a trace, and strange lights flickering between the trees at night. I wanted to believe she was just scared, maybe had been alone too long. But I knew, deep down, I had seen something that defied explanation. When we reached the town's police station, I finally got a signal and called for help. Officers arrived and took the woman inside. I gave a statement, but the officers seemed skeptical, their faces tight with disbelief. The woman was placed in protective custody. The next morning, I drove back to the spot where I found her. The car was gone, but the eerie silence remained. I noticed the ground near the forest edge was disturbed, as if something had recently been dragged away. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers haunted my dreams. Sometimes when the wind was just right, I swear I could hear them again, asking for help, waiting for someone to believe. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The night was still, the kind of stillness that feels heavy and thick, pressing down like a weight on your chest. It was the kind of night that made every little sound stand out: a distant dog barking, the faint rustle of leaves in the wind, the occasional creak of a house settling. I was driving home after a late shift at the hospital, the roads mostly empty, streetlights flickering sporadically overhead. The clock in the dashboard read 2:43 a.m., and I was grateful for the solitude after a long, draining night. My route took me down an old, seldom-used stretch of road that cut through a dense forest on the outskirts of town. The trees on either side were tall, their branches like gnarled fingers clawing at the sky. I'd driven this road dozens of times before. Usually it was just quiet and uneventful. But tonight, the silence felt different. It felt like something was watching. I shrugged the feeling off and kept my eyes on the road. About halfway through the forested stretch, my headlights caught movement at the side of the road. A figure, a woman, maybe in her late 20s, was standing there looking lost and cold. She wore a long coat, her hair hanging damp and tangled around her face. I slowed and rolled down the window. "Hey, do you need help?" I called out. She didn't respond, just stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. The streetlight flickered overhead, and for a moment her face seemed off. Pale, almost translucent. Her lips were cracked, and her skin looked stretched tight over her bones. I blinked hard. "Are you okay?" I asked again. She suddenly smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was twisted, unnatural, like something trying too hard to imitate a human expression. I shivered and locked the doors instinctively. "Sorry, I'm just heading home," I said, and started to pull away. But then she stepped closer, raising a pale hand. "Please," she whispered. "Help me." Her voice was raspy, like she hadn't spoken in years. I glanced in the rearview mirror and caught sight of her silhouette standing at the edge of the road as I drove past. The feeling of unease gnawed at me the rest of the way home. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed my front porch light was flickering, a bulb I had just replaced a few weeks ago. I shrugged it off as a faulty fixture and headed inside. That night, I couldn't sleep. The woman's face haunted my thoughts. The unnatural smile burned into my mind. I kept hearing whispers, soft and faint, like a voice calling from just beyond the walls. I tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion. At around 3 a.m., I heard a tapping at the window. I jolted awake, heart pounding. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, but there was nothing outside, just the dark trees swaying in the wind. The next day, I mentioned the encounter to a coworker, who frowned and told me about an old local legend. They said that years ago, a woman named Emily had disappeared in those woods. She was said to have been waiting for her boyfriend, who never showed up. Some said she still roamed the forest, looking for him, a restless spirit trapped between worlds. I tried to laugh it off, but the story felt too close to what I saw. That night, I drove down the same road again, hoping to prove to myself it was all in my head. As I approached the spot where I had seen her, the headlights caught her again, standing silently, eyes fixed on me. I stopped the car. "Emily?" I said hesitantly. She smiled that same twisted smile and whispered, "Help me." I was frozen. Suddenly, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath came out in icy puffs. I saw her hand reach out, translucent and trembling. I slammed the gas pedal and sped away, heart racing. When I got home, every light was out. The house was freezing cold. I found muddy footprints leading from the front door into the hallway. But I lived alone, and I hadn't heard anyone enter. I called the police. They came, found no sign of forced entry, no footprints other than mine. They suggested I might be stressed or sleep-deprived, but I knew better. Over the next weeks, the visits continued. Glimpses of her in my peripheral vision. Soft whispers calling my name, cold spots in the house. One night I woke to find her standing at the foot of my bed. Her eyes were empty sockets, and her mouth hung open in a silent scream. I bolted upright, and the figure vanished. That was when I started researching more. I learned that Emily had indeed vanished decades ago. Her body was never found. Locals said her spirit was bound to the place she died, wandering endlessly, trapped in the dead of night. I felt sorry for her, a lost soul unable to rest. But she was growing more persistent. One night I left my bedroom door open. The whisper came again, "Help me find peace." I gathered every bit of information I could find, visited the local archives, and even spoke to old-timers who remembered the story. They told me Emily's boyfriend had been abusive, and she had fled into the woods, never to be seen again. Some believed she had died from exposure, others said something worse happened. I decided to perform a small ritual to help her. I went to the woods where I had first seen her. It was just before dawn. The trees loomed tall and silent. I stood there, lit a candle, and spoke words I had found in an old book on spirits. Emily, may you find peace and rest beyond this world. Let go of your pain and be free. The air grew still. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move among the trees, like a final breath of life. After that night, the visit stopped. The cold spots in my house disappeared. The whispers faded. I never saw her again. But sometimes when I drive down that road late at night, I swear I see a faint figure at the edge of the forest, watching, waiting. Maybe some souls never truly rest. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The night started like any other for Marcus. He was working the graveyard shift at the municipal water treatment plant, a lonely job he had taken to pay the bills while finishing his degree. The facility was on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods and a vast network of old pipelines that snaked underground in every direction. Most people never gave it a second thought. It was just a bunch of pipes and tanks, pumping clean water into homes. But for Marcus, the night brought a strange kind of solitude, sometimes even comfort amid the hum of machinery. That night, it was close to 1 a.m. when Marcus finished his routine rounds, checking valves, logging pressure readings, and inspecting the clarifiers. Everything seemed normal. The facility had its usual faint chemical smell. The lights cast long shadows, and the low rumble of the pumps filled the air. He liked these quiet hours, the stillness broken only by his footsteps on the concrete floor. As he made his way back to the control room, the lights flickered for a moment, something he chalked up to the old electrical wiring. But then, a distant noise caught his attention, a faint scraping sound, like metal against concrete. It seemed to come from one of the older sections of the plant, the abandoned filtration tanks that had been decommissioned years ago. Most employees avoided that area altogether. Curious, Marcus grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the old tanks. The moonlight through the tall windows was patchy, and the air grew colder the deeper he walked. The scraping noise grew louder, echoing eerily through the empty chambers. He called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" Only silence answered him. The sound stopped suddenly. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He scanned the area with his flashlight beam, but saw nothing unusual, just peeling paint, rusty pipes, and puddles of stagnant water reflecting the weak light. Turning to leave, he noticed something on the floor. Footprints, wet and fresh, leading deeper into the maze of tanks and tunnels. He frowned. The plant was locked down. No one else was supposed to be here. His radio crackled to life with static, then a whisper so faint he almost missed it. "Help!" Marcus froze. He pointed his flashlight toward the voice's source, but saw nothing. The whispers repeated, growing slightly louder, more urgent. "Help me!" Fear prickled his skin, but he forced himself to follow the sound, deeper into the old filtration area. The air grew damp and heavy, the smell turning sour. His flashlight flickered as the whispers became clearer. "Please." Suddenly his beam landed on a figure hunched over near a rusty pipe. A woman, soaked and trembling, lay, her clothes torn and soaked through. Marcus gasped. "Are you okay? What happened?" She looked up, eyes wide and hollow, skin pale as moonlight. "I've been here," she whispered. "Trapped for days." Marcus wanted to reach out, to help, but something about her felt wrong, unnatural. The temperature dropped sharply. The woman's features twisted into a grimace of despair and rage. She lunged toward him, her hands cold and clammy. Marcus stumbled backward, tripping over debris. He scrambled to his feet and ran, the sound of her footsteps behind him echoing through the tunnels. Reaching the control room, Marcus slammed the door shut and locked it. The radio squawked with static again, then silence. His hands shook as he called security on his cell phone. No signal. Then the lights went out. He fumbled for his flashlight, turning it on to reveal the woman's face inches from the glass. Her mouth opened in a silent scream. Marcus screamed too, dropping the flashlight. The door handle rattled violently. The power flickered back on, and the door unlocked slowly. Marcus didn't wait. He ran outside into the cold night, the whispers fading behind him. When he looked back, the plant was dark and empty. He never returned, and sometimes late at night he hears that faint scraping noise outside his window. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The night was the kind that presses heavy, thick with silence, so profound it feels almost unnatural. The kind of silence that makes you notice every sound your body makes, your breathing, the shuffling of your shoes on pavement, the distant creak of a tree swaying in the breeze. It was just past 2 in the morning when Mark's car finally sputtered to a halt on the shoulder of a narrow rural road, miles from the nearest town. He was tired, bone-weary after working the late shift at the warehouse, and the sudden stutter of his engine in the middle of nowhere sent a rush of panic through him. The gas gauge needle had hovered near empty for the last half hour, but he'd convinced himself he'd make it home. Now, stranded in darkness, surrounded by nothing but endless black forest, he realized just how vulnerable he was. He grabbed his phone, only to find a dead screen. No signal, no battery life. The rain had stopped a little while ago, but the ground was slick and soaked, and the air still smelled faintly of wet pine. He locked the car doors and sat there for a moment, eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, reflecting the endless blackness behind him. Mark considered walking back toward the last gas station, but the road was long and winding, and the woods on either side looked dense and impenetrable. Besides, he knew the stories locals told about these woods, the disappearances, the strange figures seen wandering late at night. He'd laughed at those tales once. Now he wasn't so sure. As he sat staring into the darkness, a sudden flicker caught his eye in the rearview mirror, a faint, flickering light far down the road. For a moment, he thought it might be a car, but as he squinted, it became something else, a small flame moving slowly along the shoulder. Curious and desperate, Mark grabbed his jacket and stepped out into the cold night, locking the car behind him. The silence pressed down as he walked toward the light, each footstep crunching softly on the gravel. The flame bobbed ahead of him, carried by a figure cloaked in shadow. As Mark drew closer, he saw the faint glow of a lantern, the light flickering and swaying with the figure's slow, uneven gait. "Hey!" Mark called, his voice echoing strangely through the empty night. The figure stopped and turned slightly, but the darkness swallowed the face. Mark took a cautious step forward. "Are you okay?" he asked. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised the lantern higher, revealing a face pale and gaunt, eyes wide and glassy. The expression was blank, almost lifeless. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "Can I help you?" He tried again, swallowing hard. The figure's lips parted, but no words came out, only a faint, raspy breath. Suddenly, the lantern flickered violently and went out, plunging them into darkness. Mark's heart hammered in his chest as the figure stepped closer, the air growing colder with each movement. I don't know what you want," Mark stammered, backing away. But the figure reached out a hand, thin and shaking, fingers too long and skeletal. Mark recoiled instinctively. Without warning, the figure let out a low, eerie wail, a sound that seemed to scrape the very air, twisting and unnatural. Mark spun around and ran back toward his car, adrenaline surging through his veins. He fumbled with the keys, hands trembling, finally unlocking the door and throwing himself inside. The engine roared to life, and he peeled away, tires screeching on wet gravel. In the rearview mirror, the figure stood at the edge of the woods, watching, lantern now glowing again, eyes burning with unholy light. Mark didn't stop until the distant glow of town lights came into view, light, heart pounding, breath ragged. When he finally reached his apartment, he locked every door and window, lights blazing against the encroaching dark. But that night, as he lay in bed, the memory of the figure haunted him, the cold touch, the hollow gaze, the soundless scream. He swore he could still hear that wail echoing just beyond his window. Weeks later, Mark tried to find any record of the figure, missing persons reports, local legends, but found nothing concrete. Just whispers of a woman lost in the woods, a lantern seen wandering after midnight. He stopped driving that road late at night, but sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees, he swears he sees a faint light moving slowly, watching from the edge of the forest. And he knows some nights, the dead of night isn't empty at all. Story the end.
Story number 9.
It was the kind of night where everything feels just a little off, though you can't quite put your finger on why. I remember it clearly. The heavy silence outside, the oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow every bit of light from the street lamps, and the faint rustling of leaves stirred by a cold wind. I had just started working the graveyard shift as a security guard at a small industrial warehouse on the edge of town. The job was simple: patrol the building every hour, check the cameras, make sure nothing was out of place. Nothing complicated, just boring hours where your only real company was the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional flicker of a faulty security camera. I had only been on the job a few days when that night happened. The night I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The warehouse was huge, filled with rows of metal shelving packed with crates and pallets. The fluorescent bulbs buzzed and flickered overhead, casting long, shifting shadows that moved whenever the light flickered. I walked my first patrol just like the instructions said. Slow and steady, check every aisle, every corner, every door. The only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional drip of water leaking from the ceiling somewhere in the far back corner of the building. About 2 hours into my shift, I decided to take a break in the security office. The room was small and cramped, with a single desk covered in monitors showing grainy black and white footage of different parts of the warehouse. I grabbed a stale cup of coffee from the desk and sat down, scrolling through my phone to pass the time. Then, one of the monitors caught my eye. In the video feed from the farthest corner of the warehouse, just beyond the rows of shelves, something was moving. A shadow flickered past the camera's range, too quick and too dark to be a trick of the light. I squinted at the screen and zoomed in, but it was just a blurry silhouette, nothing I could clearly identify. Maybe it was just a rat or some other critter. The warehouse was old and prone to mice infestations. Still, a chill ran down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and decided to investigate. I walked through the aisles, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The air smelled damp and stale. The farther back I went, the colder it felt, like the temperature dropped several degrees without warning. I shone the flashlight across the rows of crates, but found nothing. No sign of movement, no noises besides the faint dripping water. As I turned to head back, I heard it. A low, scraping noise like fingernails dragging slowly across metal. I froze. The sound was coming from the next aisle over. Holding the flashlight tight, I crept toward the noise, each step careful and deliberate. As I rounded the corner, I saw it. A figure, hunched and shadowy, crouched behind a stack of crates. My heart hammered, but I called out, "Hey, who's there?" The figure didn't move or respond. Its outline was thin, almost gaunt, and it seemed to flicker in and out of the beam like it wasn't fully there. I took a step closer. Suddenly, the figure darted forward and disappeared down a side corridor. I chased after it, flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the walls. The corridor twisted and narrowed until it opened into a small, empty storage room. But no one was there. I scanned the room, breathing hard, trying to steady my nerves. That's when I noticed the wall. The peeling paint near the floor was darkened by something wet. I knelt down and touched it. It was cold and slick, like fresh water. The sound of dripping echoed again. I looked up just in time to see a shape reflected in the glass of an old window set into the wall. A face. Pale, gaunt, with empty, dark eyes staring right at me. I jerked back, heart racing. The face vanished. I stumbled out of the room and back into the main aisle. The warehouse was silent again, the strange figure nowhere to be seen. Shaking, I radioed my supervisor to report the incident. He told me not to worry, probably just a rat or a trick of the light, and to keep doing my rounds. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next hour passed slowly. I was back in the security office, eyes glued to the monitors, when one camera feed suddenly went black. I checked the wiring but found nothing wrong. Then, through the static, I heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from the speakers. "Help me." I spun in my chair, but the office was empty. The whisper came again, closer this time, urgent. "Help me." My skin prickled with fear. I grabbed my flashlight and headed back into the warehouse. As I walked through the aisles, the temperature dropped again, and the dripping grew louder, echoing like footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one. I pressed on until I reached the far back corner where the water was leaking from the ceiling. The puddle on the floor was growing, and in the dim light it shimmered unnaturally. Suddenly, the whispering turned into a voice, desperate, and broken. Find me, set me free. The sound was coming from the puddle itself. I stared in disbelief, heart pounding. Then a shape began to rise from the water, a translucent figure, soaked and dripping, its eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. It reached out a hand toward me, trembling. I wanted to run, but my legs felt frozen. The ghostly figure's voice echoed in my mind. Please, help me. I nodded, unable to speak. For the rest of the night, I stayed with the apparition, listening to its story. It was the spirit of a worker who had died decades ago in the warehouse, trapped beneath the flooding water after an accident no one had ever reported. It was stuck, reliving the moment of its death, desperate for release. When dawn finally broke, the figure faded away, leaving the warehouse cold but quiet. I left that job the next day. Sometimes when I pass by that old warehouse at night, I still hear the faint drip of water and the whisper of a voice asking for help. And I wonder if it's still waiting. Story the end.
Story number 10.
It was the kind of night that felt like the world had paused. The stillness pressing down so thickly you could almost hear your own heartbeat in the silence. I was working alone that night, my shift at the small-town convenience store stretching past midnight. Most of the night had been uneventful, the usual stream of drifters stopping by for coffee or cigarettes, the occasional car rolling past outside. But then things started to feel off. I was restocking the shelves near the back when I noticed movement outside the glass doors. A man stood in the parking lot, though there wasn't a car near him. It was a chilly spring night, the kind where the wind cuts through your jacket, but this guy was just standing there, unmoving, staring directly at the store like he was waiting for something. I felt a little uneasy, but nothing too strange. Lots of people pass through town at weird hours. I figured he might be looking for a ride or just shelter from the cold. I went back to work but kept glancing toward the door. Every time I looked, he was still there, still watching. After about 10 minutes, he started walking toward the entrance, when he pushed the door open and the little bell above jingled sharply. He was tall, thin, wearing a dark hoodie pulled up over his head. His face was pale, almost gaunt, but his eyes caught the light and glinted with something strange. Something that made me swallow hard. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can I help you?" He didn't answer, just stood there, staring at me and then at the aisles behind me. I told him, "We're closing soon, okay?" Still, no reply. The silence between us grew heavy, uncomfortable. Finally, he turned and walked toward the back of the store. I kept an eye on him, but told myself not to panic. Maybe he was just tired or lost in thought. Then I heard it, a soft scraping noise coming from the storage room. It was faint, like nails dragging lightly across the concrete floor. I froze and listened. The man was standing just outside the storage door, which was slightly ajar. I stepped toward him, but he suddenly turned and walked out of the store without a word. I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I locked the doors and took a quick look inside the storage room. Nothing was out of place. No sign of anyone else, but my unease didn't fade. About an hour later, the power blinked and went out. The store was plunged into darkness. The emergency lights flickered on, casting weak red glows across the aisles. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. The rain had started now, the drops pattering against the glass doors. I heard footsteps in the parking lot, slow, deliberate. I crept to the door, peeking out, no one there. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw him. The same man, standing just beyond the light's reach. He was staring right at me again. I wanted to call out to ask him what he wanted, but my voice caught in my throat. Suddenly, the store's old radio behind the counter crackled to life, a distorted voice whispering words I couldn't understand. I turned away, trying to shake the cold feeling crawling up my spine. The footsteps grew louder, circling the building. Then the back door, the one I'd checked earlier, creaked open slowly. I raced toward it, but the door slammed shut before I could reach it. The radio's static intensified, the whispers becoming clearer. "Leave, now." I grabbed the flashlight from under the counter and shone it toward the door. Nothing. When I turned back around, the man was inside the store, standing just a few feet away. His face was pale, eyes empty. I dropped the flashlight and ran for the front door. It was locked. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking. He was closer now, silent, watching. I finally unlocked the door and burst out into the rain. I didn't stop running until I was back at my apartment, soaked and trembling. The next morning, the police came by after I called to report the break-in and the man inside. They searched the store but found no sign of anyone. No footprints in the wet parking lot, no fingerprints, nothing. I never saw the man again. But sometimes when I'm alone late at night, I hear the radio whispering, and I remember that night, the night when the dead of night seemed to reach inside and never let go. Story the end.
Story number 11.
It was past 2 a.m. when David realized the silence wasn't normal. The usual hum of traffic on the distant highway, the occasional barking dog, even the rustling of trees, none of it was there. It was as if the world had stopped outside his window. He sat on the edge of his bed in the dark, the soft light from his phone casting long shadows across the room. He couldn't sleep. It wasn't uncommon for him to struggle with insomnia, but tonight felt different. Heavy, like the air itself had thickened. Even his own breathing sounded too loud in the stillness. The apartment was small, just a one-bedroom unit in an old building with paper-thin walls. He'd only been living there for 2 months, having moved in after a rough breakup. It was cheap and close enough to work that he didn't mind the creaky floorboards or the occasional flickering light. But lately, something had been off. It had started with small things he brushed off. A kitchen cabinet swinging open by itself. Keys he swore he'd left on the table ending up in the sink. Footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. The building manager blamed old pipes and thin walls. "You hear your neighbor's stuff more than you think," he said, smirking like he'd heard it all before. But tonight wasn't like the others. Tonight there was a deep stillness in the air that made the hairs on the back of David's neck stand up. He walked slowly to the living room window, pushing aside the curtain to peer into the parking lot. Nothing. Not even the blinking red light of the traffic signal down the road. The entire complex was dark. His eyes scanned the lot. No headlights, no people. The only movement came from a faint shadow near the far end of the building, right by the laundry room. He squinted. The shadow didn't move like a person. It didn't have any clear form. It pulsed slightly, one half like it was breathing. Then slowly it glided toward the stairwell. David stepped back. He didn't know why, maybe instinct, but something deep in his gut told him not to watch. He let the curtain fall and turned away, heart pounding. He sat back down on the edge of his bed, listening. At first, he heard nothing. Then, a faint creak from the hallway. Then another. He froze. Someone was walking on the old wooden floor outside his unit. Each step deliberate. Slow. Closer. He stared at the door. The hallway light underneath it was gone. Usually it leaked in a thin orange line from the overhead fixture outside. But now, there was only black. Then a whisper. Not words. Just a breath. Like someone exhaling through their teeth, right on the other side of the door. David's skin went cold. He reached for his phone, but the screen had gone black. He tapped it. Nothing. Dead. Even though he'd charged it earlier. Another breath at the door, then a soft, scratching sound. He backed away from the door slowly, not daring to make a sound. The scratching grew louder. More frantic. It was like nails on the wood. Someone was trying to claw its way in. And then it stopped. Silence. David stood motionless in the dark, ears straining. He waited for something. Anything. But the silence stretched on until his legs began to tremble. Finally, after what felt like an hour, he took a cautious step forward. Another step, and another. He reached the door and pressed his eye to the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty. He let out a slow breath and turned the lock with shaking fingers. If someone was out there, he wanted answers. This couldn't go on. He opened the door a crack, peering out into the hallway. It was dark, not dim, not low light, pitch black. He blinked, confused. The hallway always had a dim emergency light on, at least. But this wasn't normal. It was like looking into an abyss. He closed the door again, locked it, then pushed the chain across. He sat back down on the bed, hugging his knees to his chest. He didn't know what was happening, but something told him to stay put, not to move, not to make a sound. Then came the thud, a heavy, sickening thud from the ceiling. His bedroom was on the second floor, the top floor. No one lived above him. But there it was again, a deep, dragging thud, like something huge crawling across the roof. He bolted to the living room and flipped the light switch. Nothing. The power was still out. He pulled open the hallway closet and grabbed the flashlight from the top shelf. The beam flickered as he clicked it on. Weak. Dying. He pounded the flashlight in his hand a few times until the light steadied, then turned toward the window. The shadow was back. Only this time it wasn't at the far end of the lot. It was at the edge of the grass, just 10 feet from his window. Standing still, watching. He stumbled back, flashlight beam dancing across the walls as he fell to the floor. He scrambled behind the couch, holding the flashlight to his chest, the beam aimed toward the window. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there. Then came a knock, not from the front door, from the bedroom. He turned his head slowly, heart hammering. Another knock, soft, gentle, from inside the apartment. He stood slowly, taking cautious steps toward the bedroom. The knock came again. He held his breath and shone the flashlight toward the door. Nothing. He pushed the door open slowly. The room was empty. Then, movement in the corner. He turned the flashlight and the beam landed on the closet door. It was slightly open. Just a crack. But he hadn't left it that way. He was sure of it. The light flickered again. A pale hand slid out from the crack. David screamed and dropped the flashlight. It clattered across the floor, spinning, casting erratic shadows across the walls. He backed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Then he turned and ran, out the front door, down the pitch-black hallway, stumbling down the stairs in the dark. He burst out into the night air, panting, but the parking lot was still, empty. No lights, no sounds. The shadow was gone. He ran until he hit the gas station 3 blocks down. It was closed, but the floodlights over the pumps were on. For the first time that night, he could see clearly. He stayed there until the sun rose. When he returned to the apartment later that morning, everything was back to normal. Power was on, hallway lights were working, his phone powered up like nothing had happened, but the bedroom closet door was still open. And on the inside, in deep gouges carved into the wood, were 5 long scratches, as if someone or something had been trapped inside, clawing to get out. He moved out that afternoon. The building manager looked unsurprised when David handed in his keys. "Didn't like the place?" He asked. David didn't answer. As he turned to leave, the manager added, "You know, you're not the first." David paused. "What do you mean?" The man scratched the back of his neck. "That unit's had some issues. People leave in the middle of the night. Sometimes we find the place empty, door wide open, but you made it longer than most." David stared at him, heart pounding. "What's wrong with it?" The manager just smiled grimly. "Dead of night's funny, isn't it? Sometimes things wake up that shouldn't." David walked out without saying another word. He never looked back. Story the end.
Story number 12.
The night I spent in that old farmhouse is one I'll never forget, and I've tried countless times to explain what happened, to myself, to others, but words always fall short. Maybe it's because what I experienced wasn't something easily understood, something you can neatly categorize or rationalize away. It was something raw, primal, and utterly terrifying. It wasn't a dream, and it wasn't hallucination. It was real, and it still haunts me. I worked for a small real estate company that specialized in selling old properties, farmhouses, barns, sometimes abandoned cabins. It was slow going, but the pay was steady, and I liked the quiet pace. One late October evening, I was assigned to check on an old farmhouse about 2 hours outside of town. The owners wanted to sell it, and they needed someone to inspect it for damage, take photos, and assess what repairs it might need. The house had been vacant for over a year, untouched since the previous owner passed away under mysterious circumstances. The drive there was peaceful at first, the highway smooth and empty as the sun dipped behind the horizon. But the closer I got to the farmhouse, the more the landscape changed. The road narrowed, flanked by thick woods that seemed to swallow any light that tried to penetrate them. The air grew colder, damp with the smell of earth and decaying leaves. When I finally pulled into the gravel driveway, the sky had turned completely black, and the only illumination came from the dull orange glow of a distant street lamp and my car's headlights cutting through the darkness. The house itself was exactly what you'd expect from a rural farmhouse left to rot. The paint peeled from the siding, the porch sagged under years of neglect, and the windows were grimy, some cracked or boarded up. Despite its worn appearance, the structure seemed solid enough. I grabbed my flashlight, camera, and notebook and pushed open the creaky front door. The smell hit me immediately. A heavy mix of mildew, old wood, and something faintly metallic that I couldn't place. The interior was frozen in time, old furniture draped in white sheets, a cracked mirror hanging crooked on the wall, yellowed wallpaper peeling at the edges. I clicked on my flashlight and started my inspection. I moved slowly through the main floor, noting water damage in the kitchen ceiling and the unstable stairs leading to the second floor. I took pictures of everything, making notes about repairs. It was around 10 p.m. when I made my way upstairs. The floorboards groaned underfoot, and shadows danced along the walls in the beam of my flashlight. At the end of the hallway, I found a door that was locked. Curious, I jiggled the handle, but it didn't budge. I figured it must have been a closet or a storage room. As I turned to leave, I caught movement from the corner of my eye, a flicker of something dark, almost human shaped near the window. I whipped my flashlight around, but there was nothing there. Just the long curtains swaying slightly in the night breeze. I shook my head and told myself I was just tired. I decided to head back downstairs and finish up. That's when I heard it, a soft thump coming from the locked door. I froze. The house was supposed to be empty. Another thump, louder this time. I backed away, heart pounding. I wasn't sure if I should call out or just get out of there. I tried the handle again. It was locked tight. The noise stopped. I stepped back down the hallway, but then a faint whisper drifted through the air. I swear I heard my name. Mark. I swallowed hard and turned toward the sound. The hallway was empty. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just the wind, heck, or maybe an animal. I made my way back to the living room, ready to leave, but the front door was suddenly stuck. I tugged and pushed, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to set in. Then the lights flickered and went out. I was plunged into darkness. The only light came from my flashlight, but even that felt weak and small against the overwhelming blackness. I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming up the stairs behind me. I spun around, shining the light, but saw nothing. I called out, "Who's there?" but only my voice echoed back. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing my flashlight. I was in total darkness. My breath came fast. My hands trembled. Then, faintly, I heard it again. My name, whispered over and over. Mark. I fumbled for my phone, finally finding it and switching on the flashlight. The beam illuminated the room, but still no sign of anyone. I made a break for the door again. This time it opened easily. I ran outside, heart racing, and jumped into my car, locking the doors behind me. As I pulled away, I glanced back at the house. In one of the upper windows, I thought I saw a pale face watching me, eyes hollow and dark. I never went back. The next day, I researched the house's history. The previous owner had been an elderly man who lived there alone. Neighbors said he was a recluse and that something terrible had happened the night he died. They never found a cause, but there were rumors of foul play. I've never shared this story with many people. I know how it sounds, just another haunted house tale, but I know what I felt that night. I know what called my name, and I know that some places don't want to be disturbed, especially in the dead of night. Story the end.
Story number 13.
The night was unusually quiet when Sarah decided to take a shortcut home through the old industrial part of town. She'd been working late at the hospital again, exhausted from the constant stream of emergencies and long hours. The streets were deserted, lit only by flickering street lamps and the occasional neon sign buzzing overhead. Sarah was used to walking this way. She'd done it dozens of times before. But tonight, something felt different. Her footsteps echoed sharply off the cracked pavement, mixing with the soft rustle of dry leaves swept by the cold breeze. The buildings lining the street were long abandoned factories and warehouses, their windows dark and shattered, graffiti layered thick over brick walls. She tried to focus on her music to block out the eerie silence, but the earphones kept cutting out intermittently, as if some invisible static was interfering. Just as she rounded a corner near an old warehouse, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She fumbled to check it, relieved to see a text from her roommate, Mike. They'd planned to meet up the next day for breakfast. "Almost home," she typed back quickly. When she looked up, a figure stood just a few feet away in the shadows near the warehouse's rusted loading dock. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move, just stared. A man, she thought. Tall, dressed in dark clothes, face obscured beneath a hood. She couldn't see his features clearly, but she could feel his gaze burning into her. Sarah's instincts screamed at her to turn and run, but her legs refused to obey. The streetlights flickered overhead, plunging the alley into near darkness. Then they buzzed back on, and the figure was gone. Her heart hammered. She checked behind her, but the street was empty. She quickened her pace, every shadow seeming to stretch toward her like grasping hands. Halfway home, the phone buzzed again, another message from Mike. "Did you get home okay?" Sarah hesitated, fingers trembling, then replied, "Almost. Strange night." She rounded the last corner onto her street, the familiar homes and porch lights welcoming. Relief washed over her until she saw a dark sedan parked across the street with its headlights off. The car was empty, or so it seemed. She crossed quickly and unlocked the door to her apartment, locking it behind her with trembling hands. Inside, the familiar smells of coffee and old books soothed her nerves. She called Mike to tell him what had happened, but he didn't answer. Minutes later, she heard a faint tapping at her window. She froze, tapping again, soft, deliberate. She slowly approached, heart pounding. Peering through the blinds, she saw nothing but the empty street and a few swaying branches. But then, reflected in the glass, she caught a glimpse of a pale face pressed against the window from outside. A man's face, eyes wide and unblinking, mouth twisted in a silent scream. Sarah stumbled back, breath catching, and grabbed her phone to call 911. The line was dead. Frantic, she checked the doors, all locked tight. Then the power went out. The apartment plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. From somewhere outside, a low, guttural whisper filled the air. "Come outside!" Sarah backed away from the window, shaking uncontrollably. The whispers grew louder, circling the building like a living thing. Suddenly, the front door creaked open on its own. She bolted to the bedroom, locking the door. Minutes passed, then silence. When dawn finally broke, Sarah found the door wide open, footprints leading away into the night. She never stayed there again. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right, she still hears that tapping at her window. Story the end.
Story number 14.
The night was deep and heavy, the kind of night that swallows sound and time, leaving only a dense, unsettling stillness. Greg had never felt comfortable driving the old back roads alone at night, but the detour was unavoidable. The highway was closed for repairs, and the GPS routed him through a web of narrow, twisting country lanes that disappeared into thick woods on either side. It was close to midnight when the car's headlights caught the outline of an old farmhouse, nestled behind a screen of gnarled trees. A faint yellow glow spilled from a single window upstairs. Greg's phone buzzed. No signal, the message read. He was miles from town, and the fuel light had been blinking for some time now. He eased the car to the shoulder and tried the ignition again. The engine coughed, but refused to start. He sighed, shutting off the engine and grabbing his jacket. There was no choice. The farmhouse was the only sign of life for miles. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he made his way up the long, narrow driveway. The air smelled of wet earth and decayed leaves. Greg noticed that the farmhouse looked dilapidated, paint peeling, windows clouded with grime. Yet the light in the upstairs window suggested someone was home. He knocked on the weathered wooden door. Silence. He tried the handle. It creaked open. Inside, the air was thick and stale, redolent of dust and old wood. The dim light upstairs cast long shadows through the narrow hallway. "Hello?" Greg called out softly. "Is anyone here?" The only reply was the faint creaking of the floorboards beneath his feet. He climbed the rickety staircase, each step protesting under his weight. At the top, the door to the lit room stood ajar. Inside, an old woman sat by the window, her face hidden in the shadows. She looked up slowly, eyes clouded but piercing. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. Greg swallowed. "My car broke down. Can I use your phone? I just need to call for help." The woman's gaze didn't waver. "There's no one to call. The road's closed and the phones don't work out here." A chill ran down Greg's spine. "Do you live here alone?" She nodded. "No one's been here for a long time. Not since." Her voice trailed off, swallowed by the silence. Greg glanced around the room. Old photographs hung crooked on the walls, faded images of a family, children playing in the yard, smiles frozen in time. One photo caught his eye, a young girl with bright eyes and a small, mischievous smile. Suddenly the temperature dropped. Greg's breath fogged in the stale air. The woman's eyes seemed to gleam unnaturally. "There's something you need to see," she said, standing with surprising strength. "Come." She led him down a narrow corridor to the basement door. It was old and heavy, with rusty hinges. Greg hesitated, but the woman pushed it open. The basement was cold and dark, smelling of damp stone and rot. Greg flicked his phone's flashlight on and scanned the room. At the far corner, there was a small, broken window letting in a sliver of moonlight. Against the wall, old toys were scattered. Dolls, missing eyes, a cracked music box, a tattered teddy bear. Then he saw it. A faint outline of a small handprint smeared in dried blood on the wall. His heart pounded. What happened here? The woman's eyes filled with tears. She was taken, lost to this house. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut behind him. Greg spun around, fumbling with his phone, but the light flickered and died. In the suffocating darkness, a soft giggle echoed. He heard footsteps, tiny, slow, dragging along the cold stone floor. "Please," a whisper came, breath cold against his skin. "Don't leave me." Greg's blood ran cold. He pounded on the door, screaming for help, but the house swallowed his cries. Then a cold hand gripped his ankle, icy and unyielding. He scrambled back, the flashlight flickering weakly. The basement was alive with shadows, shapes twisting, faces fleetingly visible in the darkness, eyes shining with sorrow and rage. Greg's breath came in ragged gasps as he forced the door open and bolted up the stairs. He didn't stop running until he reached his car, finally able to start the engine. As he sped away, the house stood silent and dark behind him, the faint glow in the upstairs window fading. He never returned, but sometimes when the wind was just right, he could swear he heard the soft, desperate giggle drifting through the trees. Story, the end.
Story number 15.
When I first moved to northeastern Pennsylvania, I wasn't looking for excitement. I wanted the opposite: quiet, solitude, maybe even a bit of loneliness. I was 37, divorced, and burned out from 15 years working graveyard security shifts at hospitals and warehouses. What I found was a cheap rental cabin a few miles outside of Montrose, sitting on a stretch of road that barely made it onto most maps. The landlord was an older man named Hal, who lived in a neighboring property, though you'd never know unless you walked a half mile through the trees. He was the one who showed me around. The cabin was simple: one floor, a wood stove, a tiny kitchen, and a back room that had probably been a pantry but now held a narrow cot. It was what I wanted. I signed the lease that afternoon. That first week, I settled into the rhythm of country silence. No cars passing by, no neighbors, just wind and the creak of old wood. Nights came down heavy and thick, the sort of darkness that swallows everything, so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. It was peaceful at first, until it wasn't. On the sixth night, I woke around 2:30 a.m., drenched in sweat, my ears straining toward a sound I couldn't quite place. The room was black, but something had pulled me out of a deep sleep. I sat up, reaching for the flashlight I kept on the crate I used as a nightstand. I held my breath. There was nothing, just silence. I told myself it had been a dream. Old habits die hard, though, and I stayed awake another hour, flashlight in hand, listening. Eventually, I drifted off. The next night, it happened again. This time, I woke to the sound of creaking, floorboards bending slowly, rhythmically, like footsteps, but not mine. I hadn't moved. I held perfectly still. The sound seemed to come from the kitchen. 1, 2, 3 slow creaks, then silence. I didn't go check. I don't know why. Something in my body just locked up, like a weight pressing down on my chest. It wasn't fear, not the kind that makes you scream or bolt. It was colder than that. More final. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was just the house settling. Old buildings make noise, especially ones surrounded by forest and cold. That explanation held until night 10. That night, I didn't fall asleep right away. I stayed up reading by flashlight, conserving the generator fuel I'd used during the day. I think it was just after 3 a.m. when I heard it again. Footsteps, but this time they didn't stop. They creaked slowly across the kitchen floor, down the short hallway, and stopped directly outside my room. I turned off the flashlight. Total darkness. Not even the weak moonlight made it through the trees. I sat on the cot, frozen, barely breathing. The air was different. Heavy. Thick. I waited. Then came the softest knock I've ever heard. Just 3 taps, spaced perfectly apart. Not loud, not aggressive, but deliberate. I didn't move, didn't answer, didn't make a sound. Eventually, the feeling passed. I don't know how long I sat like that. Could have been minutes, could have been hours, but I didn't open that door. In the morning, I found nothing. No footprints, no damage, nothing out of place. Still, I walked the perimeter. I checked the windows, doors, even the trees around the cabin. No signs of anyone, and yet I knew someone had been there, or something. Or something. I didn't sleep the following night. I stayed up with the generator running, every light on, the old hunting rifle I'd brought propped beside me. Nothing happened. No sounds, no footsteps, no knock. I tried to stay rational. I told myself I was probably experiencing stress, isolation, maybe even sleep paralysis. I'd worked night shifts for over a decade. My circadian rhythm was wrecked. I decided I'd go into town the next day, get some proper blackout curtains, and maybe even a cheap camera system. I didn't tell Hal. Something told me not to. That afternoon in Montrose, I asked a clerk at the hardware store about motion sensor cameras. He pointed me toward a cheap set and asked where I lived. When I told him, his expression changed. "You up by Crutch Hollow?" I nodded. He hesitated, then said, "Ha! That place, people say things about it. Weird stuff. Just locals being locals, I guess. But just keep your doors locked, okay?" I wanted to ask more, but he seemed nervous, and I didn't want to spook myself further. I got back just before sundown and installed the cameras. One facing the front door, one down the hall, and one in the kitchen. I checked the feed. Everything looked good. That night I turned off the lights and sat in the dark again, the monitor on my lap, the rifle across my legs. Nothing for hours. Then, just before 3:30 a.m., the hallway camera flickered. Not static, not interference, more like a sudden dip in signal. When the feed came back, something stood at the edge of the frame. It was dark, too dark to make out detail, but the shape was unmistakable. A figure, just standing, facing the bedroom door. I didn't move. I watched the monitor as the figure raised its hands slowly and knocked. 3 times. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. The figure stayed in place, unmoving, for another 30 seconds, then stepped backward, out of frame. I grabbed the flashlight, turned it on, and threw the door open. Nothing. I cleared the house. All the doors were still locked from the inside. The footage was still on the SD card. In the morning, I took it into town, but the footage was corrupted. Just black frames and static. No usable video. I tried to show the clerk at the hardware store that, but he just gave me a polite smile and shrugged. That night, I didn't turn the lights off. I sat with the rifle again, exhausted, my head foggy from too many sleepless nights. The knock didn't come. Instead, I heard a voice. At 2:58 a.m. it started, so soft I thought it was wind. But it grew. A whisper, low and guttural, echoing through the walls. Not from one place, everywhere. The same words repeated over and over, "Let me in." Over and over again. I covered my ears. The voice continued. "Let me in." I yelled, trying to drown it out, but my voice felt hollow, swallowed by the thick blackness of that night. Then, silence. Total and absolute. The air felt thin, the temperature dropped sharply, and I swear I saw my breath hang in front of me, even though it was early autumn. I must have passed out because when I woke, the sun was rising. The room was warm again. Everything looked normal. I packed my things. I didn't even shut the windows. I threw my gear in the truck and drove down the dirt road like I was being chased. I didn't stop until I hit the next town over. I called Hal from a gas station payphone and told him I was leaving. I didn't care about the lease. I didn't even want the deposit back. He didn't ask why. I stayed in a motel for a few nights, then drove back to the city. Found a roommate, got a part-time job. I've never been back to that cabin. But sometimes, when I lie in bed late at night, I still wake at 2:58 a.m., my room goes quiet, I feel the cold return, and for a split second I hear it, just on the edge of my hearing, behind the walls of wherever I sleep. Let me in. I don't move, I don't speak, and I never ever open the door. Story the end.